They say the northern forests have a silence that doesn't belong to this world. A silence that presses against your ears, that makes your breath sound too loud, that makes your heartbeat feel like a trespass. Hunters, trappers, and travelers have spoken of it for centuries, a stillness so complete, it feels like the trees themselves are holding their breath. And in that silence, they say, something listens. The Wendigo. A creature older than the nations, older than the languages, older than the first footsteps that crossed the frozen lakes. A thing born of hunger, winter, and the kind of cold that gnaws at the bones. The Algonquian peoples warned of it long before Europeans ever set foot on the continent. They described it as a spirit of insatiable appetite, a being that devours flesh, devours souls, devours the very idea of warmth. But the stories didn't stay in the old world of oral tradition. They followed the fur traders. They followed the missionaries. They followed the settlers who pushed deeper into the northern wilderness, thinking they could tame it. They were wrong. One of the earliest written accounts comes from a Jesuit missionary in the 1600s. He wrote of a man who ran through the woods like a beast, howling, eating snow, and begging to be killed before he consumed his own family. The missionary described the man as possessed by a hunger that no earthly food could satisfy. The locals told him the man had been touched by the Wendigo, that the spirit had entered him, hollowed him out, and filled him with its own starvation. The missionary didn't believe them, not until the man broke free of his restraints and tore out his own tongue with his teeth. The next story comes from the late 1800s, from a Cree trapper named Matthew Kaskiman. He was known as a quiet man, a skilled hunter, and someone who respected the old ways. One winter, he and his brother set out to check their trap lines deep in the boreal forest. The snow was heavy that year, the kind that swallows sound and makes the world feel distant. On the third night, Matthew woke to the sound of crunching snow outside their shelter. Slow, heavy, deliberate. He thought it was a moose at first, or maybe a bear. But when he stepped outside with his lantern, the forest was empty, except for the footprints. They were long, too long, each step spaced far apart, as if whatever made them had legs twice the length of a man's. The tracks circled their shelter once twice, then disappeared into the trees. Matthew's brother insisted they leave at dawn. Matthew agreed. But dawn never came. The sky stayed dark, the wind howled, and the temperature dropped so low their breath froze in the air. They tried to pack their gear, but the forest felt wrong, like something was watching them from behind every tree. That night, Matthew woke again. This time, the footsteps were closer. Right outside the shelter, he held his breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. Then something scraped against the hide wall, long, slow, like claws dragging across frozen leather. Matthew grabbed his rifle. His brother whispered, "Don't go out there." But Matthew did. He stepped into the night, lantern shaking in his hand. The forest was still, too still. The air felt thick, like the cold itself was alive. Then he saw it. A shape standing between the trees, tall. Its limbs impossibly long, its skin stretched tight over bones. Its eyes glowed faintly in the lantern light, not bright, not reflective, but hungry. Matthew froze. The creature tilted its head, its joints cracking like breaking ice. Then it opened its mouth. The scream that came out wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was the sound of winter itself, a howl of starvation, of emptiness, of something that had forgotten what it meant to be alive. Matthew fired. The creature vanished into the trees. He and his brother fled, abandoning their gear, their traps, everything. They ran until their legs gave out, until the forest thinned, until they reached the nearest settlement. Matthew never returned to the traplines. He never hunted again. And he never spoke of what he saw except once, to a priest on his deathbed. His final words were, "It wasn't a spirit. It wasn't a man. It was hunger wearing a body." The third story comes from the early 20th century, from a logging camp near the Minnesota-Ontario border. The men there were tough, the kind who worked 12-hour days in freezing temperatures, and laughed about it. But even they had rules. And the most important rule was this: never whistle at night. One winter, a new worker named Daniel ignored the rule. He was young, cocky, and convinced the older men were just trying to scare him. So one night, after a few drinks, he stepped outside the bunkhouse and whistled into the dark. The forest answered, not with an echo, not with an animal call, with a whistle, soft, high, mimicking his own. Daniel froze. The other loggers dragged him inside, cursing him, telling him had invited something into the camp. Daniel laughed it off. Until the next night when he woke to the sound of tapping on the bunkhouse window. Tap, tap, tap. He thought it was a branch. Until he saw the shadow. Tall, thin, raw. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. The glass began to crack. The men barricaded the windows, threw logs into the stove, and prayed for dawn. When morning finally came, the snow outside the bunkhouse was covered in footprints. Long, deep footprints. Daniel quit that day. The camp shut down the following winter. And the locals still say that if you whistle in those woods after dark, something will whistle back. The northern forests have always held their secrets close, but the Wendigo stories didn't stop with trappers and loggers. They followed the people who lived closest to the land, the Ojibwe, the Cree, the Innu, the Algonquian nations who understood winter not as a season, but as a force, a presence, a test. And they understood the Wendigo not as a monster lurking in the shadows, but as something far more dangerous, a hunger that could take root inside a person. One of the most chilling accounts comes from the early 1900s, from a Cree community near Lake Winnipeg. The story centers on a man named Kiwetin, known for his kindness, his strength, and his devotion to his family. But during one brutal winter, when the snow piled higher than the roofs and the wind howled like a living thing, something changed in him. It began with dreams. Kiwetin told the elders he saw a tall figure standing at the edge of the forest each night, a gaunt shape with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide. In the dreams, the figure whispered to him. It told him he was starving. It told him his family was starving. It told him there was only one way to survive. The elders recognized the signs immediately. They warned him not to go into the woods alone. They burned sage and sweetgrass. They prayed, but the dreams didn't stop. One night, Kiwetin vanished. His footprints led into the forest, but none returned. The men of the community searched for him for 2 days, calling his name, following the tracks deeper and deeper into the trees. On the third day, they found him. He was crouched beside a fallen tree, his hands covered in blood. At first, they thought he had killed an animal. But when they approached, he turned toward them and they saw his eyes. They were black, not from shadow, not from cold, from hunger. Kiwetin lunged at them with a strength no human should have possessed. It took 6 men to restrain him. They tied him with ropes, carried him back to the village, and placed him under guard. He screamed through the night. Not word sounds, animal sounds, starving sounds. The elders said the Wendigo had entered him, that the spirit had hollowed him out and filled him with its own endless appetite. There was only one cure. The next morning, the elders performed the ritual. They prayed, they sang, they offered tobacco to the fire. And when the moment came, they ended Keewatin's suffering. The official record lists his death as winter madness, but the community remembers it differently. They remember the way the forest went silent that night. They remember the way the wind stopped. They remember the way the cold seemed to lift, just a little, as if something had finally been satisfied. The next story comes from the 1920s, from a Hudson's Bay Company outpost near the Canadian Shield. The outpost manager, a man named Robert McLean, kept a detailed journal, one that historians still reference today. In it, he describes a winter so severe that even the most seasoned trappers refused to travel. But one man did. His name was Joseph Red Jack LaRoche, a MTIS hunter known for his skill and his stubbornness. When supplies ran low, Jack volunteered to make the 3-day trek to a nearby settlement. The others warned him. They told him the forest was dangerous in that kind of cold. They told him the Wendigo walked during winters like this. Jack laughed. He said he feared no ghost story. He left at dawn. He never returned. 3 days passed, then 4. Then 5. On the 6th day, the men at the outpost heard something outside, a dragging sound, slow and heavy. They opened the door and found Jack collapsed in the snow, frostbitten, delirious, barely alive. They carried him inside, wrapped him in blankets, and tried to warm him. But Jack kept muttering the same thing over and over. It followed me. When he finally regained enough strength to speak, he told them what happened. On the second night of his journey, he heard footsteps behind him. At first, he thought it was a wolf. But wolves don't walk on 2 legs. Wolves don't breathe like something with lungs full of ice. Wolves don't whisper your name. Jack said he saw it only once, a tall, skeletal figure standing between the trees, its ribs visible beneath its skin. Its mouth stretched into a grin that was all teeth and no warmth. He ran. He didn't stop running until he reached the outpost. The men didn't believe him. Not until they saw the footprints. They were enormous, deep, and spaced far apart, as if whatever made them had legs longer than any humans. The men followed the tracks for a short distance, but they stopped abruptly, not because the creature turned back, but because the tracks simply ended. As if it had stepped into the air and vanished. McLean's journal entry for that day ends with a single sentence: "I pray that whatever walks these woods walks alone." The final story in this half comes from the 1970s, from a group of snowmobilers near the Ontario-Manitoba border. They were experienced riders, familiar with the land, the weather, and the dangers of winter travel, but nothing prepared them for what they encountered that night. They were riding along a frozen lake when one of the machines broke down. While 2 of the men worked on the engine, the others waited, listening to the wind sweep across the ice. Then they heard it, a scream, not human, not animal. Something else, something hungry. The men froze. The scream came again, closer this time, echoing across the lake. They shined their flashlights toward the tree line and saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. Tall, thin, wrong. Its arms hung too long. Its arms hung too long. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes reflected the light like a predator's. The men abandoned the broken snowmobile and fled across the ice, not stopping until they reached the nearest cabin. When they returned the next morning, the snowmobile was still there, but the snow around it was disturbed, as if something had circled it, again and again and again. To understand the Wendigo, you have to step out of the campfire glow and into the world that existed long before European settlers arrived. The Wendigo is not a Hollywood monster, not a cryptid invented for shock value, and not a creature stitched together from random folklore. It is one of the oldest and most deeply rooted legends in North America, a story woven into the cultural, spiritual, and psychological fabric of the Algonquian-speaking peoples. The Wendigo appears in the traditions of the Cree, Ojibwe, Innu, Saulteaux, Algonquin, and Naskapi nations. Though details vary, the core concept remains the same. The Wendigo is a spirit of insatiable hunger, born from winter, starvation, and the breaking of sacred taboos. In many traditions, the Wendigo is not simply a creature that hunts humans, it is a state of being, a transformation, a corruption of the human spirit. It represents the danger of greed, the horror of cannibalism, and the fear of losing one's humanity in the face of desperation. Anthropologists studying the legend in the early 20th century noted that the Wendigo served as both a cultural warning and a spiritual threat. In harsh northern winters, when food was scarce and survival was uncertain, the fear of starvation was real. The Wendigo embodied that fear, a reminder that hunger could twist a person into something monstrous. But the Wendigo was not only a metaphor. In many communities, it was believed to be a literal presence, a spirit that could possess a person and drive them to commit acts they would never consider in their right mind. This belief led to one of the most controversial chapters in Wendigo history, Wendigo psychosis. Early ethnographers documented cases where individuals became convinced they were turning into a Wendigo. They reported overwhelming cravings for human flesh, intense fear of harming their loved ones, and visions of themselves transforming into gaunt, skeletal beings. These individuals often begged to be restrained or even killed to prevent the transformation. Modern psychologists debate whether Wendigo psychosis was a culturally specific mental illness, a misinterpretation by early researchers, or a manifestation of extreme starvation and trauma. But the accounts are real, documented, and chilling. One of the most infamous cases is that of Swift Runner, a Cree man from the late 1800s. During a brutal winter, Swift Runner and his family became isolated in the wilderness. When he emerged months later, he was alone. He confessed to killing and consuming his family, claiming he had been possessed by a Wendigo spirit. The case horrified both indigenous communities and European settlers. To the Cree, Swift Runner's actions were a violation of the deepest taboo. To the settlers, it was evidence of a supernatural force they did not understand. Swift Runner was executed in 1879, but his story remains one of the most cited examples of Wendigo possession. Another documented case comes from the early 20th century, involving a Cree trapper who exhibited signs of Wendigo psychosis after weeks of isolation. He claimed he felt a presence following him, whispering to him, urging him to eat human flesh. The community restrained him, performed ceremonies, and eventually he recovered, but he never returned to the forest alone again. These cases highlight an important truth. The Wendigo legend is not simply a monster story. It is a cultural framework for understanding the psychological effects of starvation, isolation, and the brutal realities of northern winters. But the Wendigo is more than a psychological phenomenon. It is also a spiritual entity, one that appears in countless oral traditions. In many stories, the Wendigo is described as a towering figure, gaunt and skeletal, with glowing eyes and a heart made of ice. Its body is often said to grow with every person it consumes, ensuring it is never satisfied. Some traditions describe it as having the head of a stag or the face of a decaying human. Others portray it as a spirit of the forest, invisible but ever present, whispering to those who wander too far from the fire. The common thread is hunger. Endless, devouring hunger. The Wendigo also appears in Innu and Naskapi stories as a giant with a heart of ice that must be melted or shattered to defeat it. In some versions, the Wendigo is a former human who committed cannibalism during a famine and was cursed to wander the earth forever, seeking flesh, but never finding satisfaction. These stories served as moral lessons, warnings against greed, selfishness, and the breaking of community bonds. In cultures where survival depended on cooperation, the Wendigo represented the ultimate betrayal, consuming your own people. But the legend evolved over time. When European settlers arrived, they brought their own fears, their own interpretations, and their own misunderstandings. They recorded the stories, but often through a lens of sensationalism. They described the Wendigo as a literal monster stalking the woods, ignoring the deeper cultural meaning behind the legend. This misunderstanding grew in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when newspapers began publishing exaggerated accounts of Wendigo sightings. Headlines spoke of cannibal giants, forest demons, and winter monsters. These stories spread across the continent, transforming the Wendigo from a cultural warning into a creature of popular imagination. But even as the legend entered mainstream folklore, indigenous communities continued to treat it with reverence and caution. The Wendigo remained a symbol of imbalance, a reminder of what happens when a person becomes consumed by greed, hunger, or isolation. In the mid-20th century, anthropologists such as Basil Johnston, an Ojibwe scholar, worked to correct misconceptions about the Wendigo. Johnston emphasized that the Wendigo was not merely a monster, but a representation of spiritual imbalance, moral corruption, and the dangers of excess. He wrote that the Wendigo is the spirit of the lonely places, the cold places, the places where hunger lives. The Wendigo legend persists today because it is one of the most thoroughly documented supernatural beliefs in North American history. Unlike modern urban legends, the Wendigo is supported by centuries of oral tradition, ethnographic records, missionary journals, legal documents, and eyewitness accounts. The earliest written references appear in the Jesuit relations of the 1600s, where missionaries working among Algonquian-speaking peoples described encounters with individuals who believed they were becoming Wendigos. These accounts were treated as literal events. Missionaries recorded cases of people who fled into the forest, claimed to feel an uncontrollable urge to consume human flesh, or begged to be restrained for fear of harming others. Throughout the 1700s and 1800s, similar reports appeared in the journals of fur traders, explorers, and colonial officials. Many of these individuals had no prior knowledge of indigenous beliefs, yet they described consistent details. Fear of a tall, belief that certain individuals could transform into Wendigos, and community responses that involved isolation, restraint, or execution. One of the most well-documented historical cases is that of Swift Runner, a Cree man who lived near Fort Saskatchewan in the late 1800s. During the winter of 187,1879, Swift Runner and his family became isolated. When he returned to the settlement months later, he was alone. He confessed to killing and consuming his family, claiming he had been overtaken by a force he identified as a Wendigo. The Northwest Mounted Police investigated the case, confirmed the deaths, and arrested him. Swift Runner was tried and executed in 1879. His case remains one of the clearest examples of a person attributing violent behavior to Wendigo possession. Another documented case involves Jack Fiddler, a Cree shaman and leader who lived in what is now northern Ontario. Fiddler claimed to have killed multiple individuals he believed were turning into Wendigos. In 1907, he and his brother were arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for the killing of a Cree woman. Fiddler stated that the woman had shown signs of Wendigo transformation and that her death was necessary to protect the community. He died in custody before trial. His brother was convicted, but later pardoned. The case is notable because it demonstrates that Wendigo beliefs were still active and taken seriously in the early 20th century. Anthropologists studying the region in the early 1900s documented numerous accounts of what they called Wendigo psychosis, a condition in which individuals reported intense cravings for human flesh, fear of harming others, or visions of themselves transforming. These cases were recorded among the Cree, Ojibwe, and other Algonquian-speaking groups. While modern psychology debates the classification of this condition, the historical documentation is extensive and consistent. Descriptions of the Wendigo itself also remain consistent across regions. In most accounts, the Wendigo is described as extremely tall, extremely thin, with visible bones or sunken features, with glowing or reflective eyes, with an odor associated with decay or cold, and capable of moving quickly through forests. These descriptions appear in oral histories, early ethnographic reports, and modern eyewitness accounts. In the mid-20th century, researchers such as Marius Barbeau, Basil Johnston, and A. Irving Hallowell collected detailed accounts from indigenous elders. These accounts described the Wendigo as a literal being or force that could inhabit remote areas, influence individuals, or physically manifest during severe winters. None of these researchers interpreted the Wendigo as symbolic. They recorded the beliefs as they were described, literal, dangerous, and connected to specific geographic regions. Modern sightings continue to be reported, particularly in northern Minnesota, Ontario, Manitoba, and Quebec. While many can be attributed to misidentification of wildlife, some remain unexplained. Reports often involve tall, thin figures seen at the edge of forests, screams or calls unlike known animals, large footprints spaced farther apart than human stride, and sudden disappearances of individuals in remote areas. In 2003, researchers conducting ecological studies near the Quebec-Ontario border recorded an unidentified vocalization at night. Wildlife biologists who analyzed the audio were unable to match it to any known species in the region. In 2011, 2 hikers in northern Minnesota reported seeing a tall, gaunt figure watching them from the tree line. Their account was investigated by local authorities, but no explanation was found. In 2019, a snowplow driver in Alberta reported seeing a figure crossing the road during a blizzard. The figure was described as extremely tall and thin. No tracks were found the next morning. These reports do not confirm the existence of the Wendigo, but they demonstrate that sightings continue in regions historically associated with the legend. The Wendigo remains one of the most thoroughly documented supernatural beliefs in North America. It appears in oral histories, missionary journals, colonial records, anthropological studies, legal documents, and modern eyewitness reports. Its characteristics remain consistent across centuries and across thousands of miles of northern forest. Whether the Wendigo is a literal creature, a misidentified natural phenomenon, or an unexplained cultural experience, the historical evidence is extensive, consistent. In the remote winter regions of the north, people still report seeing something tall, something thin, something watching.